With, I suppose, a revisitation. Let's revisit that little tip that we gave people last month in terms of news to keep an eye on, in the shape of Northampton Borough Council and the Cross. What's happened in that news story? Well, can you update us?
Oh, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Um, Essentially, just to recap for people who are new to the storyline, the Northampton Borough Council happens to have within its area one of the three surviving Eleanor crosses that were erected by Edward I on the stopping points of the coffin of his wife, or the remains of his wife, Eleanor of Castile, on her way from Lincoln, where she died, to London. It's a Grade 1. It's a listed ancient monument. It's a fabulous piece of medieval high art, and it's deteriorating rapidly. There are plants growing out of the Queen's feet. So a few weeks ago, we reported that Northampton Borough Council was coming under pressure to carry out remedial work to save the monument from further deterioration, and with a view to restoring it properly, as everyone believed they were the owner. But the council then denied all responsibility, saying it wasn't theirs, it actually belonged to the county council. The county council said no, it belongs to the borough council, and then people online started posting documents that the borough council had on its own website, which showed that it was a council asset and that they put budgets towards it before, and basically it looked as though they'd been caught bang to rights. But then, after a good deal of pressure, the councillor Tim Hadland, who's the responsible councillor in the Northampton Borough Council cabinet, went onto the BBC and said that they'd applied for scheduled monument consent, and they were going to commission contractors, and they were taking quotes, but actually they were still arguing about who owned it, and as far as he was concerned, it belonged to the people of Northampton.
Oh, I see. So the people should all turn up at once and de-weed and reconstitute this monument. I see. Okay.
Actually, Mark, there's a subtext to this. It looks very much as though from what Councillor Hadland told the BBC, the council sees it as a national monument, and they don't see why local council taxpayers should actually pay for its upkeep.
Right.
Now, you could argue that they've got a point, because it's on a national list. It's a national. It's listed as an important national monument, and in fact, one of the other three surviving crosses is actually owned by English Heritage. But, and it's a significant but, if Historic England and the government accepted council's point, then any owner of a nationally listed ancient monument, archaeological site or whatever, could apply the same principle. That isn't going to happen in the current financial environment. So if the council does want to offload the responsibility, then it would have to do it to a charitable body, or gift it to an organisation like the National Trust or English Heritage. Of course, the problem there then is this is a passive monument, if you like. It's not one that can generate income.
No.
And again, in the current environmental climate, you have to ask who would take it on. So,
and also as well, there's an element of presumably no one in the locality would want a little National Trust booth next to it, effectively shielding people from visiting it properly without paying. In that sense, it is people have a right of access.
The point is, if you look at the location of it, it's actually right next to a road. You can't make it a visitor attraction.
No.
People can park close by and walk up to it and enjoy it, and that's how it should be. The problem is, and this is really symptomatic of an issue that crops up regularly, where a building is recognised, or a site is recognised as being important, as nationally important part of our cultural heritage. But what isn't taken into account when that designation's made is how it's going to be maintained. And so and in the worst cases, you end up with situations like this. So I think in terms of of what's happening with the story. Yes, it looks as though the remedial work is going to take place, although we don't know on what timetable yet. The council haven't published a timetable. They're certainly, I think we can say, reluctant to take it on in the long term. And an independent stonemason who was asked to look at the cross basically said it needed urgent work, and the longer it was delayed, the more urgent the work would become, and actually, by extension, the more expensive it would become because more would be required.
Well, and this is all part of I think a broader conversation, which I think is becoming increasingly urgent in this country, and that is who's going to pay for all this heritage we've got lying around. It's one of those things where Britain has a really strange relationship with its history, in so much as in so many ways we rely on it, and arguably the further, I suppose, the further you are up the wealth graph, and perhaps along the towards the right end of the political spectrum, the more you hang your identity on certainly a post Norman invasion identity in Britain. Sort of, my father was fought at Agincourt, all this kind of, not my father, but you know what I mean. My great grandfather fought at Agincourt. So there are people who utterly rely, and indeed as a country, I think arguably our identity is known around the world as being a very heritage-rich landscape, and yet at the same time, certainly in terms of the public purse, and often in terms of sort of, especially for example, local coffers, no one really wants to shell out for it. I don't want to necessarily go into detail, but I mean this reminds me of a news story that I saw yesterday, where there was a gentleman who was complaining in York about he found some Saxon gold in his garden.
Oh, yes,
and you might have seen this, where he was complaining supposedly about the poultry sum that he was offered. I think it was £2,800 for
That's
this.
right, from the Portable Antiquities Scheme, the valuation panel.
Yeah, exactly. And what was interesting is that he was saying, well, it's not really about the money, it's about the fact that the government wants to steal my property. Now, in that instance, you had this really complicated matter where it had been declared treasure, so technically it is the Crown's property, and therefore he couldn't sell it on independently anyway. And also he was claiming that he'd been offered a certain amount of money for it. But the point is, is that there's no one can afford to pay him £250,000 for this stuff, because there's just no money available in the public purse. And so in that moment you have precisely the same issue, whereby you have someone who apparently loves the history, it's not about the money, he says, and yet wants to monetize it, and yet at the same time as well doesn't want, in a roundabout way as it were, the community doesn't want to pay for it. So where does it end up? And so here you've got a fixed monument as opposed to a treasure that's in a similar sort of in a similar problem. And I suppose,
and in fact, it's worth mentioning as well that when regular viewers and readers of the Pipeline will know that Northampton Council has a form in this area, because when they sold the statue of Sekemka against a huge amount of opposition, international opposition, 2 years ago, one of the arguments they put forward was that an ancient Egyptian statue of world class wasn't relevant to local people, you can see hints of that here. This is a national monument. Why should local people put up the money to keep it maintained?
Well, that's precisely it. In so much as, so the reason why I sort of like clenched my fist there was that people seem to want to disown this heritage when it's convenient to disown it, and yet at the same time, if, for example, that particular cross was bringing in tourists. Goodness knows, I mean, in an extreme example, the council would have remodelled the road area in order to cordon it off, in order to monetise access. It's one of those things where it is heritage as a resource, and in the same sense, again, the reason why I mentioned that treasure story, people seem to want to be able to, as it were, monetise our heritage and our history. But you've got to accept that if this is a marketable resource, then at some point people need to pay for the upkeep of this resource.
Another thing that's interesting about the Eleanor Cross is that just up the road is Delapre Abbey, which is undergoing a multi-million-pound, in fact, it's just about to open after a multi-million-pound Heritage Lottery refurbishment. and an early iteration of the application for that had money put aside for work on the Eleanor cross,
Hmm.
because it was at Delaprey Abbey that Eleanor of Castile's remains were kept overnight, and why that cross is there.
Hmm.
It's only a short walk from Delaprey Abbey, so a bit of joined up thinking, and it could all have been sorted. But for reasons we can speculate about, go into, it's known that the Delaprey project went over budget. Certainly in certain areas went over budget. Um, you know, it wasn't sorted out as a coherent story, which it was, and now we're ending up with people scrabbling around to pick up pieces.
Hmm. So management, funding, there's all sorts of issues, and I'm sure that these sorts of issues are ones which we'll return to in the future on the Watching Brief.
Sadly, I think we will.
But again, I suppose I mean, yeah, it's one that it saddens me in so much as someone commented on the Facebook page yesterday, the RQC Facebook page, talking about how well, isn't it enough to look after these sorts of things for the good of the nation? And in that sense, they then went on to say, but they admitted that they had rose tinted glasses, and in that sense, I share those rose tinted glasses. But at the moment, to be honest, they've very much slipped. And what I want now is not so much people to honor history and look after it. I want them to actually just have an honest conversation. I'm kind of fed up of people having this double standard when it comes to history and heritage. And I don't know. Maybe we'll see more of cases like this, and perhaps hopefully the conversation will move forward in the years to come.
I think the history of these things tells us that at some point there will be a very embarrassing crisis over a major national monument.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, it was the Rose Theatre in London, and that will concentrate people's minds, and there'll be remedial action will be taken, which will stave off the problem for a few years at least.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Eleanor Cross has left some people slightly cross.